Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study in Luke chapter 9. We're picking up in verse 12 of chapter 9 today. Jesus is about to feed 5,000 men. Miraculously, he is not cooking. Anyway, if you would like the notes, there are links down in the description below. There's also a link to our Patreon account where you can support this work and future work coming up. And check out our website at tobelikechrist.com for some of the resources that we already have out and that are available for download right now for free, many of them. Okay, chapter 12, verse 17. Remember, in the last video, Jesus has gone to Bethsaida, to a desolate place. He went there to rest, but he was met by a bunch of people who wanted healing and wanted him to help them, and he had compassion on them, and he's been working amongst that crowd. Now that's where we pick up in verse 12. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came and said to him, "Send the crowds away to go into the surrounding villages and the countryside to find lodging and to get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all of these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." And they did so, and had them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing over them. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And they all ate and were satisfied. And what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. So this day that Jesus was helping all these people was quickly wearing away. They'd already made a boat trip across the sea. Jesus was helping all these people. Now it's getting late. And the apostles became concerned for the people. They wanted Jesus to send the people away so that they could go into the towns. They could buy bread, buy something to eat, find a place to spend the night. And Jesus looked at the apostles and he said, "No, that's okay. You give them something to eat." And, the text doesn't describe like an awkward pause here. And it doesn't mention that the apostles laughed, thinking that Jesus was joking. But there had to have been some kind of shocked response on the apostles' face, some kind of delay in them responding. You can imagine if you were in that situation. Jesus, of all people, knew that they had neither the supplies or the money to provide all of these people with food. Jesus was asking them to do something that was impossible. Excuse me. So what did they do? Well, they looked at their inventory and they looked at their resources and they determined that it couldn't be done. It says, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish here, and clearly that isn't enough to do the job, so this isn't going to happen. Now, John 6, verse 6, when it records this miracle, it says that Jesus said this to test them. He told them to feed the 5,000 to test them. Test them for what? Well, I think probably to test where they believe that their sufficiency came from, their sufficiency to carry out the commands of God. At the beginning of Luke chapter 9, what were the apostles doing? They were going out preaching, but they were also working miracles and confirming the word of God. Remember? Casting out demons, healing the sick. But here, when Jesus asks them to feed the 5,000, what's the first thing that they do? They conclude that it can't be done. It's out of their power to do it. Well, so was healing people and casting out demons, but yet they accomplished that. And yet they haven't seemed to learn the lesson. They haven't internalized the lesson that if God asks them to do something, he's going to empower them to do it. Now, I'm not necessarily ragging on the apostles for this, because if I was in this situation, I probably would have said the exact same thing that they said, because all of us better need to internalize the truth that it is God who makes us sufficient for the work that he calls us to do. But there's 5,000 people in front of them, and they looked at their wallets and they proclaimed, "Nope, not going to happen." John chapter 6, verse 7 says that Philip answered Jesus. He says 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. So 200 days worth of pay wouldn't be enough for me to go to the town and buy food for all of these people. And the text says that there were 5,000 men But that wasn't including women and children. So there were probably, who knows how many others who were listening to Jesus, and they would have needed to be fed too. So 5,000 is just kind of it's a partial number. So they look at their wallets. And it's interesting that when Jesus sent them out on the limited commission, what did he tell them not to take? Wallets, right? Provisions, money. Don't think that you're going to succeed because you take enough provisions with you. That's not what's going to enable you. God's going to be the one who takes care of you. And yet here they are looking into their wallet for their provision. They should have looked right back at Jesus and said, show me how to do it. I don't know how to do that. You showed me how to work miracles when I was preaching. Now show me how to accomplish this work that you want me to do. We know that you have the power to do it. Show us. That should have been their response. Hopefully that's your and I's response when a situation like this comes up. How often, and driving this application home a little bit more, how often does God tell us to accomplish something, or we see a need in the church or in the kingdom or in the world that needs to be met? We know this is something that God would want us to do, and we come back to God with our personal inventory and all of our excuses for why it can't be done. Well, I don't have enough talents. Well, I don't have enough money. Well, I don't have enough time. Instead of looking at whether we personally are sufficient to the task, what we ought to be doing is to look to God to show us how to do it. We ought to read God's commands in the Bible and respond with, show me how. I feel like this needs to be done. I feel like you would want me to do this, Lord. Show me how to do it. It may seem out of our reach. It may seem out of our wheelhouse. It may seem like God is asking for us to do something impossible. But don't you think that God puts those things in front of us sometimes, gives us commands in the scriptures that we then apply to our lives that seem impossible, to do exactly what he was doing with the apostles, to test them, to ask the question, how much do you really believe? You profess to be a Christian. You claim that you work for me. You claim that you're my servant. You claim that I'm all-sufficient. Does that actually, those truths that you claim you believe, actually manifest in your actions in your life? A lot of times, I got to be honest, the answer is no. And that's a shame that we live that way, even though we profess to believe a very different way. So, Lord, help us to have this kind of trust and to have this kind of an attitude. Now, when God uses our insufficiency, when God uses us to accomplish something, even though we are insufficient, it's an opportunity for God to receive the glory. We are weak servants. We are not great in and of ourselves. We are sinful people with weaknesses and struggles, and we don't always do things the way that we should. But when God accomplishes something through his earthly, weak servants, it gives the world a reason to glory in God. And really, that's our purpose. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, that when that happens, the surpassing power of God is put on display. He says that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And anyone with any self-awareness will know that they are not surpassing in power and insufficiency. God doesn't care about your empty wallet. In fact, your empty wallet probably makes you a better candidate for him to work through, and it ought to encourage us to look to him for what we need to make us sufficient. That's why Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." So Jesus was about to remind the apostles of his sufficiency in this act of service that he's going to do for all of these people. Jesus took something very ordinary, 5 loaves and 2 fish, to do something extraordinary. And isn't that the message of our application? We are very ordinary. God can do something extraordinary with us, but it's not going to be done through our own greatness and sufficiency. It's going to be done through God's power. These 5 loaves and 2 fish didn't have the ability to be anything but 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus could make them into something amazing. The miracle fed the 5,000 men, but it also left behind a reminder of the extraordinary power and the overflowing sufficiency. I feel like I've used that word like 10,000 times now, but that's the word of the day. It reminded the apostles of Jesus' overflowing sufficiency when they picked up the leftovers afterwards. How many were there? There were 12 baskets. There was one for each of the apostles to pick up and to reflect on what had just been done. God is not low on a supply of grace to accomplish impossible things. And the 12 baskets that followed the feeding of the 5,000 ought to encourage us that when we think we've dreamed big for the glory of God, to dream a little bit bigger.